I've mentioned before how important pore depth is for realistic rendering, but what I haven't shown you is how I like to monitor pore depth throughout the sculpting process. And this will involve some rendering and materials, which I don't want to be a distraction at this point. We'll go over all that stuff in detail in the texturing and shading chapter. So to keep our focus, I've created a separate blend file for easy copy and pasting our sculpture into that scene so we can do some render tests. And so to copy from this scene, I recommend changing your level viewport in the multi-res to a low value like 2, because that will copy and paste faster. And I want to take the sculpture and then shift select the eyes and then hit Control C. And you should see a notification that 2 selected objects were copied. And then I want to go File, Open, and I can hit Don't Save since I haven't changed anything. I just selected the objects. And you want to find the file called Pore Depth Testing that's included with your source files. So we'll open that up. And before I paste, what we have going on in here is a simple light setup with a camera and a cube in the middle. So if you want to stay organized, I recommend selecting the portrait collection and then hitting Control V in the viewport, and that will paste our sculpture in that collection. And what you want to do is position your sculpture inside the bounds of this box, because the scale does matter when it comes to subsurface translucency shading. And so in order for the test to be standardized, we need to move our sculpture into this box and make sure it fits within. However, to make this a little easier, I will select my eyes, shift select the head, and then hit Control P and parent the eyes to the head. Now I only have to worry about selecting our head, and the eyes will go with it. All right, so hitting 1 on the number pad, I should enable screencast keys. And you want to make sure that our head fits within the bounds, but comes close to the edges from the front. It's okay that the shoulders are extending beyond the box. The main measurement is top to bottom. And also from left to right, just make sure it's in the center of the box. I mean, you don't have to be super precise, but get it close to what you see here. Basically, you don't want your head like this, okay? The subsurface shading will be off if that's the case. And speaking of scaling, if you bring your head in and it's this big, that's okay. Just move it into position, scale it down, make sure it fits pretty close. All right. And then once it's positioned in the box, you can hit the 0 key to look at the camera, or rather through the camera's lens. So this is what we will see in the render. And you can hit Control B and either select the entire window to render the whole frame, or just select where we know there's detail. So Control B, and I'm selecting just the head and the middle of the neck. All right, so now with our camera positioned, and I usually like to turn the head just a little bit, something like that. Though I do recommend doing tests from several angles. Do it from the side, turn it to the other side, 3/4 front. But just for an initial test, I'll leave it sort of slightly turned, really an unimportant detail. But with the head still selected, we're ready to add the material. So if we go to our material properties and click this button, there is a pore depth test with a fake user. It has that F in front of it, so we can select that. And that's really all we have to do. We're ready to hit render, which I will go ahead and do. Now I am rendering with GPU. If we go to our render settings, so I'm using the GPU compute device because I have a decent GPU. And I'm going to be looking at between a 4 and 5 minute render for my machine. And this is where you will see kind of the capability of your machine come into play. So if you don't have a GPU, this file will resort back to CPU rendering, and it'll probably take significantly longer. But if you already know a bit about rendering, you're more than welcome to adjust these render settings. But if you're not so familiar, you should be able to just load the file, copy and paste your sculpture, and get a reliable test render. So let's talk about this shader, because it's not really intended to look like a real head yet. You might even think it looks a little bit freaky with the eyes being pure white and the skin not really being human, but that's okay. This is purely a utility for diagnosing the quality of the translucent shader effect with our skin pore detail. And before we can really understand the translucent effect, I want to render another version. I'm going to switch to slot 5, hit escape, and then open a new user interface panel at the bottom and change it to the shader editor. Okay, so the pore depth test material, at the top of the subsurface, I'm going to remember this value 0.15 and change it to 0. And now when I render, we will have 0 translucent effect. And then we'll switch between the two so we can see the difference. Okay, let's maximize this with Control Space. So this is the version with 0 subsurface scattering. And if I hit J, this is with subsurface scattering. Switching back and forth. Hopefully you can tell that there is a distinct soft translucent effect thanks to the subsurface scatter. But when it comes to the pore detail, let's look at the lower eyelid here. These details are pretty strong. We can see a sharp, dark shadow underneath that pore detail. And then we switch to the translucent version, and those details are all still there, but the shadow is not dark anymore. It's got like an orangey kind of glow to it, and that's what the translucent effect does. And that's what I meant earlier by your detail can be washed out if it's not strong enough. So translucency by nature will downplay and diminish your details. And if we didn't do this test during the sculpting process, then it would at least be a major buzzkill once we get to the shading and lighting portion, having to go back and update our sculpted pore details. And so remembering in hindsight, we sculpt looking at this kind of representation where there's no translucency. And so our pore details look stronger than they do on an actual face. But it can feel uncomfortable sculpting pore detail this way with that built-in disconnect. And so that's why I highly recommend you get in the habit of testing your pore detail throughout the pore sculpting phase. Now, you have to be asking yourself, well, what does it look like if my pore detail is too shallow, or what does it look like if it's too strong? And let's do a test. Let's switch to slot number 7. And before I make any changes, I'm going to hit Shift-Control-S to save a new version of this. Just add an 01, okay? Because I'm going to want to go back and reload this file after this test. And so in this scene, let's simply jump to sculpt mode, Control Space to go back to our user interface. And I'm going to focus here on the forehead. Below this wrinkle right here, I'm going to use the Fill Deepen brush to diminish this pore detail. All right, I want to make sure that the strength is pretty low. And then start sculpting over the surface. And that's going to fill the pore detail. So let's hit Control Z to see before and after. All right, the pore detail is still there, but it's more subtle. And I think I've already said this before, but when I started sculpting portraits, my tendency was to sculpt too subtle rather than commit to the harsher details. And so I would often sculpt details like this, and it ended up being too subtle. On the other side, I'm going to hold Control, making sure that my brush has this invert to scrape disabled. All right, so that means that when I hold Control, it's going to deepen the existing details. So I'm going to do this and increase the strength actually, so that my details get a lot stronger, okay? So these details are too strong. And let's see what that looks like in the render. Hit the 0 key, and then I will hit Control B and just highlight this area here. And then I might as well go back to object mode for efficiency. And let's render that and see what it looks like. Okay, so that is with translucency turned off. Let's go to slot 8 and do it with translucency on. Switching that subsurface back to 0.15 and rendering again. Okay, so let's maximize this. And here we have the non-translucent version. You can tell obviously the pores are really dark, and the pores below the wrinkle are still there, but they're more subtle. But you can definitely tell that there's shadowing in the pore detail. Now when we switch with J, first I want you to keep an eye on the subtle. Let's go back to no translucency, and then with translucency. What little detail there was is almost completely gone. See, keep an eye on this area especially. It's the most obvious section of pores in the area that we smoothed out. And then with subsurface on, you can barely tell that it's there. And so if you are too subtle, you can put a lot of work into the texture detail just to have it wiped out whenever you add subsurface. That's something you definitely want to avoid. Because as you've seen, it's quite a lot of work to add texture detail. And if we got it to that perfect point where we love the way the pores look, but then the shader tells us it's too shallow, we have to go back. And there's really not a good global way to deepen all the pore details. You have to go back manually and deepen them. So you really want to avoid that. On the other hand, when the pores are too strong, let's take a look at the non-translucent version. And when we switch to the translucent version, some of that gets washed out, but also you can see some unrealistic light spots. And let me show you what that's about. So if we go back to our full head version of the translucency, in the thinner areas of skin, more light is going to travel through that area and make it glow a little bit brighter. And so like we can see here at the upper eyelid that borders the caruncle, it's a very thin piece of skin and it's brighter in value and color. But when we switch to the exaggerated pore detail up here, the light is able to bounce in these thinner areas, causing a brightness around the pore holes. And so it further exaggerates the depth. And so this is the other end of the spectrum. You don't want to be too deep. Now, I will say that if I'm going to err on one side or the other, I would rather they be too deep than too shallow, because I find that you can salvage deeper pore detail a little bit better than trying to deepen pore detail that's too shallow. So hopefully with that test, you're better able to diagnose pore detail that's too shallow or too deep. And next, I want to show you some actual improvements that I want to make due to this render test. But remember, I don't want to keep that exaggerated pore detail. So I'm going to revert my scene and real quick render another version with subsurface on 0.15 so that we can diagnose for some real changes. Okay, let's take a look at this with some critical eyes. Overall, I'm very happy with the pore depth because secretly I have been performing this test in between each lesson of the pore sculpting process. And so that's kept me at a nice balanced depth. But there are some things that this test has revealed that I want to change. The first one is if we look at the wrinkles, the very small, tight wrinkles coming from the bottom eyelid and then stretching towards the cheek, this screen left side I really like, but on screen right, this one at the bottom, I think is just a little too much. It gives us 1, 2, 3, 4, and kind of a half. So like 4.5 wrinkles that are all pretty parallel to each other. And I think 3.5 is fine, but this bottom one I think sticks out like a sore thumb to me. So I'm going to try and remove that detail. But what's a little funky about removing this kind of detail is you can't simply erase it out. Remember, they're layered stamps, and so I kind of have to unsculpt this detail in a way, but we'll see how that works in a little bit. But that's the first thing I want to change. The second thing is the nose, which doesn't really have to do with the pore detail as much as just seeing the head in a more finalized rendered state. I find that the nose is a little too bland, a little too simplistic in its shape, in my opinion. And I think a couple little changes will make it more interesting, or at least match the organic quality of the rest of the head. Remember, in the last pass, I added some very subtle touches with the crease brush that emphasized some of the underlying musculature. Well, I didn't do that on the nose, and I think it's showing in this render. And instead of muscle detail under the nose, I'm going to try and emphasize just a little bit of cartilage detail under the nose. So that's the second thing I want to address. The third thing is the vermilion border on the bottom lip, I think extends a little too far all the way into the corner of the mouth. Typically, the vermilion border will smooth out as it reaches the corner, and it's most prominent towards the front, like 3/4 of the bottom edge of the lip. And so that's just bothering me a little bit. So I will revisit that area. And then finally, if you look here at the ear, we get a bright spot in between the helix and antihelix. And when you get a bright spot like this, remember, it's a sign that the surface is very thin. Just like I mentioned earlier with the upper eyelid, how thinner areas start to glow more. This is telling me that our ear got way too thin in this one area. And I need to double check that part of the sculpture and make sure that the thickness is more consistent. This is telling me that it's not consistent. And so I would never have known that unless I did a render test, but that's a pretty simple fix. And so since we have this set up, we might as well make the changes here because we can easily transfer our details back to our other scene if we need. So let's switch our slot to slot 8, escape, and we can jump into sculpt mode, though I did rotate the head. I don't think that'll be a problem. I think if I sculpt with symmetry on, it should respect the local space. But let's double check that actually. All right, so if I have X symmetry enabled, and let's turn down the levels, sculpt to like, let's say 3. Okay, yeah, so I think it is local space. Yeah, it looks that way. Okay, very cool. That means I can leave the head slightly rotated. And the reason I would want to do that is so I can see an equivalent before and after render. But now I know I can leave it here and still sculpt symmetrically. Now, the first thing to adjust was that wrinkle. And so if we jump back to 6 sculpt levels and disable symmetry, that wrinkle right here, this is the one I want to try and remove. So I'm going to jump over to my pen, and I do not want to use the smooth brush. If I try that, remember there's a bunch of other skin detail that's going to get washed out with the wrinkle. So we don't want to do it that way. I think I'm going to try to basically sculpt the opposite of what the wrinkle was in the first place. But I can't really do that with the crease brush because holding control still pinches inward. It just pushes out or in respectively. So I'm going to try with the draw sharp brush. As far as I know, this one does not have as much of a pinch, if any pinch in fact. So this is kind of like a crease brush without the pinch. And so if I zoom in pretty close, make sure my strength is fairly low, like 0.5, and sculpt outward, so not holding control, I should be able to lightly push this out. Okay, it looks like my radius is too consistent. Let's enable pin pressure sensitivity for the radius. Here we go. I'm just trying to push the center of that crease outward. And I'm going to have to do the opposite of what I did in the first place. And there was 2 passes. Remember, we did a broad one and then a thinner one, a really tight one. So let's say I'm doing the tight one first, and then I need to do it again with a slightly bigger brush radius. Now, I will say that this is tricky to do, trying to sculpt the opposite. So take your time, since it's only one wrinkle that's really bothering me. You know, it's worth the extra effort, but I'm slowly starting to get rid of this. Okay, so I think I've done maybe all that I can do with the draw sharp brush. Let's try the fill brush now. I like this one as kind of a pseudo smooth brush because it maintains the details. It's just lessening the depth. And I think if I go over this area, it should diminish that wrinkle. Okay, I think that's pretty good in terms of diminishing. All right, I think that wrinkle is definitely less noticeable than the others. Even if there's some residual wrinkle left over, as long as it's not as strong as it was before, then I'll be happy. Moving on to the next thing, which was our nose. I'll go back to the crease brush, just like I did in our last video. And to refresh our memory, let's jump back over to our trusty Anatomic Lex reference tool. And if I have the skin and enable the labels B part of the skeletal layer, you can see our cartilage here. And the details I'm just going to barely emphasize are the major alar cartilage and the lateral septal cartilage, the contour in between. That's what I want to touch on. And then possibly the outside of the major alar. So let's try that using a broad crease brush. And I'm going to do it asymmetrically. So over on this side, just hold control and lightly push in. You can just barely see that crease start to form. And then same thing on the other side. I want to be subtle. I do not want to make this too strong. Yeah, and that tiny little detail adds more interest, more anatomical fidelity. And then on the outside of the alar cartilage. Okay, I think that does look better. Some people have a pretty distinct central crease, but I think that's a pretty strong decision to make. So I'm going to maybe dial that back a little bit. And then the very last thing I might try is just slightly emphasizing the ridge here. Again, you can easily go too strong on the nose and kind of cross over to overly exaggerated. Like I think that sort of did there. So let's undo that. Redo. Yeah, I want to be a little softer. There we go. Okay, now I think the nose has just a little more anatomical fidelity matching the rest of the face. And then the next thing I wanted to adjust, that's right, was the bottom lip and the vermilion border. It's just too defined going into the corner of the mouth, and it's typically not that defined. So let's jump down to a sculpt level of 3 and enable our X symmetry and hold Shift. And I'm going to smooth this out. Well, in fact, maybe inflate it inward. to diminish the volume there. Let's hit undo, see before, then redo to see after. Yeah, I think that's the right decision. And also maybe with my crease brush kind of push in this crease here. Let's see, what is that called? I forget. If we turn on our skin labels, the labiomarginal sulcus or marionette line. I want to push that in a little bit stronger. All right, let's see what that looks like at a level of 6. I think that looks better. It's still kind of too defined for my taste. So what if we jump down to level 5 and do the same sort of thing, just inflate it inward a little bit, maybe smooth out some of the detail. I'm just kind of getting an odd pinch in here. So I need to jump up and down in the levels to solve that. The lower you go, the easier it is to smooth out. Also, you can smooth it without affecting the higher res details. So like the way we have this zigzag, that's just not, it's not looking good. All right, that's starting to look better. All right, let's see it at a level of 6. I don't want to push this too far. It's just a minor annoyance. I don't want to drastically change that area needlessly. But yeah, I do feel like the corner of the mouth just sits more naturally now. Though I may have been a little clumsy with my inflate at level 5. You can kind of see a ridge here that formed. I think I'm going to be happy with that. I don't know. I'm kind of on the fence if I'm honest with you. I might try and revert that somehow, but let's do a render test, trusting the criticism that led me to do that in the first place and see what the final result is. Now, the last thing is the thickness of the ear. So let's switch to a lower subdivision like, I think we should be able to do that at a level of 2. And if we switch to wireframe mode, it should be easier to see. All right, so if we look at that area, it is much thinner there than the rest of the ear. The thing is, I like the way the ear looks from the front view. So instead of adjusting the front, let's just adjust the back, since we really won't even see that. It's kind of a safe change to make. Now with the inflate brush, I can push it out, but you want to make sure, which should be the default, that front faces only is enabled so that we don't push out the other side at the same time. Just using my mouse, clicking and dragging and puffing this area out, jumping back to wireframe, kind of keeping an eye on the thickness. Okay, it needs to go a little bit more. Back to wireframe to judge. All right, and you can kind of see a cross section of the whole ear, which helps you to gauge. And I think just a little bit thicker up here towards the top side. And I think we should be good. Yeah, that's much more consistent. Make sure the other ear looks good as well. I think it does. And then the very last thing I want to do, which I haven't talked about, at least not in a while, is an asymmetry pass. Because as we've discussed before, faces are never perfectly symmetrical. And so it's just one more thing we can do to help push our sculpture towards realism to add some asymmetry. And I'm going to do this as a shape key. All right, so let's click the plus button and I'm going to call this asymmetry. Wait a minute, I always spell that wrong. I think it's 1 S, 2 M's. And I will push this up to a level of 1. And then in our modifier, let's enable sculpt the base mesh, right? So this will show us our multi-res detail on top of the changes we make to the base mesh. And so I'm recommending you be very subtle here. You do not want to push the asymmetry too far. Just the slightest nudging of facial features will create the desired effect. I'm going to start with the nose, disable X symmetry, obviously. And with a large grab brush, I'm just going to kind of pull the nose off to one side. Just a little bit, very, very little bit. Then take one of the nostrils, move it out wider. Take the columella, move it out to the other side. All right, just tiny, tiny changes. And let's see what it looks like on and off. I really should probably split my view here so I can easily turn off my shape keys and adjust the multi-res. And let's turn off asymmetry. You can see that just ever so subtle shift. All right, and then we'll venture down into the mouth and maybe pull one side of it upward a little bit. Bring the corner of the mouth just slightly down. How about bring out one corner of the chin down as well? It's probably a little too much. Let's undo that. See what it looks like on and off. See what I mean? Just subtle changes. And initially it might look a little weird since we're so used to seeing the symmetrical version. But over time, I think you'll find that this does make your face look more relatable. And then for the ear, we can do the same sort of thing. Just slightly pull it out. Maybe the lobe comes out as well. All right, just subtle, subtle changes. And oh, we haven't adjusted the eyes at all. Same principle, maybe bring down the upper eyelid ever so slightly. Maybe the cheekbone comes down too. Maybe the center of the brow comes up a touch. I mean, I am really emphasizing the fact that this is subtle. And I think that this should be fine. There we go. Just a little bit of asymmetry. And I actually think maybe I went too far on the mouth. Yeah, let me bring that back down slightly. You also don't want to make this person look like they're emoting. We want to keep it neutral. And if you move these things too much, it can start to look like an expression, which you want to avoid. All right, so let's save this as a new version. Jump back to object mode, and I'm very curious now to render our head with the changes. Let's make sure if we go to render, view render, okay, we are on slot 8, which will transition nicely from slot 7, okay? All right, let's see the before and after. All right, so you can see the detail that's been added to the nose, the slight asymmetry being moved around in multiple areas. Also, the ear no longer has that thin spot right there. Excellent. And what about the mouth? Okay, so that changed maybe the most. Let's see, that's what it was before. I'm not sure which one I like better. Something weird definitely happened with these changes. I think I went in a little too overzealous about that. So I may need to address those one more time. Oh, and then this wrinkle. All right, so this is the before. Yeah, we pretty much got rid of that wrinkle while maintaining our other details. So yeah, I think that's an improvement too. So aside from this, anatomically questionable corner of the mouth that I want to take another look at, I hope by now you understand the value in these render tests while you sculpt, because it can greatly improve your decision making. And I want to conclude this video with a progressive loop of these renders that I did in between each pass of the pore sculpting process. Again, between each pass, I perform this render test, which again makes it a lot easier to decide if my pore depth is correct, but also it's pretty neat to see the progression of each layer into the final result. So I strongly encourage that you do this depth pore testing and hopefully achieve the right balance instead of having to adjust it later.